Thank you.
Tarja, Heinz, Taba.
Tarja, Heinz, Taba, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I'm also very glad to meet you once again. And first and foremost, I'd like to thank both the Russian and foreign participants of the Valdai International Discussion Club for your substantive contribution to the work of this club. And I'd like to thank our distinguished guests for their willingness to participate in a frank, open discussion. Our distinguished moderator has wished me a good retirement in due time, and I wish that for myself as well. This is going to happen, but until I have retired, since I'm still the head of a large power, and that's why I have to show restraint, and I have to tread carefully about what I say. Aggressiveness is not my style. But still, I think in this audience, we have to be frank with each other. We have to engage in an open discussion. Otherwise, it's going to be absolutely senseless. It's going to be bland and uninteresting. So that is the style set forward for our discussion. I think it's in great demand today. Against the backdrop of the drastic changes we're witnessing in this world, the current topic of the Valdai Club today starts our future. The shaping of tomorrow is very apt. Last year, here, we talked about chaos and the world order. Unfortunately, over the last months, we have not seen any changes for the better. To be honest, there have been no changes for the better. The controversies related to the redistribution of political might and influence are only growing. Mutual mistrust narrows our capacity to respond to the challenges the international threat is faced with, the real threats, the real challenges. The very globalization project is under threat. In Europe, we know that, we hear that. We hear talk about the failure of multiculturalism. We believe that this situation is to a large extent due to hasty, mistaken choice, self-complacent choice that was made by the elite of several countries 25 years ago. Back then, at the end of the 90s, 80s, beginning of 90s, there was a chance not just to spur forward the globalization process, there was a chance to make these processes harmonic and sustainable. But judging themselves to be the winners of the Cold War, some countries have chosen to reshuffle the world order to make it suit to their interests. They were in the grasp of euphoria, and they have virtually decided not to engage in frank dialogue with other participants of the world life. They didn't want to perfect the existing mechanisms. They have decided to broaden their and expand their values, their norms, their mechanisms all over the world. They have chosen their own way of security for the select, not for everyone. But as it has turned out, not everyone agrees with that. Let's be quite frank, we understand full well many were in disagreement, but some simply could not withstand the pressure. Some was not ready to do that. But as a result, the world relations system is always febrile, so to speak. The world economy is in a systemic crisis. The principles, the rules that exist both in politics and in economics are constantly reshuffled. Quite often, we see a U-turn with regard to several years ago was a dogma, a norm. If the powers that be see that something is suitable to them today, they make all the rest follow the new standard. But if these standards become obsolescent in their views, they are jettisoned and new rules are set, or at least there are attempts at doing that. So a decision was taken to use missiles against Belgrade and the heart of Europe, then against Iraq, against Libya. And in Afghanistan, as we know, the operation was launched without the sanction of the UN Security Council, trying to turn to their advantage the strategic balance. Some countries have decided to demolish the international legal regime that prevented the deployment of new ABM systems. Terrorist groups were established and provided with arms. Their atrocities push thousands, millions of people to migration, and whole regions have been plunged into chaos. We see that the freedom of trade is being sacrificed. So-called sanctions are used to exert political pressures in circumvention of the WTO. Closed economic alliances are established with firm rules, and only the transnational corporations of the countries that establish these blocs gain the fruit of that. Why is this happening? Because these countries fail. They have failed to sort everything out within the WTO, so they have decided to put the WTO aside. That's what I've mentioned. And we do not see the willingness of our partners to sort out the issues in true. There are some obsolescent structures like NATO. Despite all the talk about the need to adapt to the new reality, we have seen no adaptation. There is another important mechanism to ensure the transatlantic security, the European security, the OSCE, and there are attempts at turning this organization into an instrument of someone's political interests. So what the OSCE is doing is simply void. Mythical threats are devised, like the so-called Russian military threat. Certainly, this can help gain some advantage, get new budget, make your allies comply with your demands, expand NATO, deploy the equipment and troops closer to our border. Certainly, it is very pleasant to pass for the champions of civilization against the new barbarians. But the thing is, Russia is not trying to attack anyone. That would be ridiculous. Yes, I read your analysis, not just those who are present here today. I hear the analysts from Europe, from the US, and I see that these suggestions are simply ludicrous. In Europe, there are 300 million people, all are members of NATO. I think the US population is 600 million, whereas the population of Russia is just 140 million people. So it would be ludicrous. And yet, such menaces are used as a pretext to serve their own political interests. Hysteria has been fueled within the US with regard to Russia's alleged influence upon the current presidential election. Indeed, the US has many acute challenges like the colossal public debt, to an upsurge in violence with lethal arms used, and arbitrary reactions of the police. I think this is what they should talk during the election. Probably they should talk about that. But the elite do not have much to say. They do not have anything to pacify the society with. So it's far easier to divert the attention of people, to concentrate their efforts on Russia's alleged spies or conduits of influence. I'm wondering, I'd like to pose the same question to you. Is there anyone who seriously thinks that Russia can in any way influence the choice of the American people? Is the US a banana republic? The US is a great power. If I'm wrong, please correct me. So a question arises. Should all of this continue like that in future? What do we have in store for the world? What would the world look like tomorrow? Is there an answer to such questions as how to ensure security, stability, economic growth, sustainability? How can we expand the welfare of our people? However sad that may seem, there is no consensus with regard to these matters. In the world, probably during the discussions that have taken place here, you have arrived at a common conclusion. If that is the case, I'd be curious to listen to that. But certainly there is a shortage of strategies and ideologies for the future, and this in turn creates an atmosphere of incertitude, which has a direct impact upon social sentiments. Social surveys and polls conducted all over the world testifies that people across all continents view future as something gloomy, something looming. Future is not bright and encouraging. It is frightening. People do not have mechanisms to influence this future, to influence the choice of the politics.
Well, yes, formally. There is every aspect of democracy in modern countries: elections, freedom of speech, access to information, the right to express opinion, but even in the so-called developed democracies, most citizens do not have any real influence on the political processes. They do not have a direct, real influence on the authorities. Citizens feel that their interests and the ideas of the elite about the only right course are very different and are increasingly different. As a result, elections and referendums surprise the authorities because people do not vote in the way authoritative, respectable mass media sources advise them to do, not as it is recommended by the so-called system parties. Public movements which were considered too pro-left or too leftist or rightist are pushing back the political hard weight. First, these results were announced, something abnormal. When these results repeated once again, ideas were voiced that the society does not understand those people who are actually at the Olympus. And there is even hysteria that this is a consequence of foreign, as a rule, Russian propaganda. Let me tell you, dear friends and colleagues, I would love to have that propaganda machine in Russia. But unfortunately, this is not the case. We do not have these global mass media, CNN, BBC, and some others. We do not have these capabilities yet. As for the idea about the triumph of populists, it's not about populists and others. It's about the fact that grassroots citizens fail to trust the ruling elite. By the way, the political agenda has been exhausted. The elections cease to be an instrument of change. Elections turn into scandals, into discussion of compromise and information, into discussions of who sleeps with whom. This is simply outrageous. And to be frank, if we take a look at the programs of various presidential candidates, it seems that they are based on the same standards. There is very little difference or no difference at all. Or it seems that they fail to witness the erosion of the middle class when ideological models are imposed, which, as I believe, destroy the cultural and ethnic identity. In some cases, in some countries, national interests are being sacrificed. Sovereignty is denied in exchange for the good treatment on behalf of the owner. So, a question arises. Who is right? The majority of people who want simple things such as stability, free development of their countries, prospects in life for themselves and their children, preservation of security for themselves and their families. People are scared by the fact that terrorism is turning into everyday reality. a terrorist act can take place at the neighboring street, if not at their own street, and any material at hand can turn into weapons of mass destruction, from improvised explosives to trucks. Terrorist attacks that have taken place over recent years in Boston and in other US cities, in Paris, in Brussels, in Nice, in German cities, and unfortunately in Russia as well, show that terrorists do not need cells or any organizational structures. They can act on their own, independently. The only thing that it takes is to ideologically motivate and to send them against enemies, against us. The example of terrorist danger shows our inability to assess the character, the nature, and the reason of increasing threats. We see this as we witness the situation in Syria. We do not manage to stop the bloodshed and to launch the political process. It seems that after these law negotiations, after compromise, we began to form the single front, the single anti-terrorist front. But this is not the case. This front has not been set up. Our personal agreements with the US president did not work as well. There are forces in Washington who have done everything in order to prevent these agreements from being brought to life. And all this shows the irrational willingness of the West to once again repeat their mistakes, to repeat the same mistakes all over again. We all see what's going on in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, in other countries. And I ask myself, where are the results of anti-terrorism and of anti-extremism? On the global scale, well, we do have results on the regional level, but there are no global results in the fight against terrorism, and the threats keep increasing. We all remember the euphoria of some capitals with regard to the so-called Arab Spring. Where is this euphoria now? And Russia's calls for joint fight against terrorism are being ignored. Moreover, terrorist groups continue to arm, to supply, to train. Terrorist groups are still being trained, supplied, to be used for political goals. This is a very dangerous game, and I would like to once again address such actors. Extremists are smarter, wiser, and stronger than you, and by playing with them, you will always lose. Dear participants of the forum, it's obvious that today it is important for the international community to focus on real problems that the whole mankind is facing. Solving these problems would allow to make our world secure and stable and turn the international relations system into an equality-based and just system, and turn the globalization process from the globalization for the chosen ones to globalization for all. I'm sure that we can overcome all differences and contradictions only together on the solid basis of the Charter of the United Nations. It is the UN that remains today the structure which has no equals in terms of its representation and universal nature. It is a unique platform for an equal dialogue. The universal rules of the UN are needed to involve as many actors as possible into the process of humanitarian integration to guarantee their political responsibility and ensure their coordination of their actions while preserving their sovereignty and their individual development models. We do not have any doubts. We are convinced that sovereignty is the central notion of the system of international relations. Strengthening sovereignty guarantees peace, stability at both national and international levels. There are few countries which, as Russia, can base their actions on 1,000-year-old history, and we have learned to value and cherish our independence and freedom. At the same time, we do not claim to dominate in the world, to expand, to confront. In our understanding, true leadership is not about inventing some threats and try to influence others by speculating with these threats. We believe that true leadership is to see real problems, is to pool efforts from all states together, and this is how Russia understands and sees its role in global affairs. The priorities without which the prosperous future of our planet is impossible are obvious. I'm not going to add anything new. This is an equal and indivisible security for all states. Only if we stop armed conflicts and guarantee peaceful development of all countries, only in that case we will be able to talk about the economic development and find a solution to socioeconomic and humanitarian issues. It is important to indeed fight terrorism and extremism, not just on paper. These evil can only be fought through pooling efforts of all states of the world. Russia has been proposing this to all interested partners. We need to place on the international agenda the issue of restoring solid statehood, economy, and social sphere in the Middle East. We need to develop a long-term and comprehensive program. We need to develop a somewhat Marshall Plan for this region that has been torn apart by conflicts, and Russia is ready to be actively involved into this work. World cannot be made stable without progressive development of the global economy. We need to set up conditions for progressive and fruitful labor, for the economic growth, to make sure that the world is not divided into those who always win and those who always lose. The rules of the game must give a chance to developing economies to catch up with those who we call developed economies. We need to even the economic growth rates so that the results of economic development and technological development could be available to everyone. And in that case, we will be able to settle one of the gravest problems of today, poverty. It is obvious that economic development must be mutually beneficial and based on universal principles so that each state could become an equal participant of the world economic affairs. In the middle term, it seems that the world economy will continue to regionalize, but regional agreements must supplement instead of substituting universal norms and rules. Russia is in favor of harmonizing regional economic formats based on the principles of transparency and respect for each other's interests. That is how we are building the work within the Eurasian Economic Union. That is how we conduct talks with our partners, including to link the projects of the Eurasian Economic Union with the One Belt, One Road project of China. We expect to be able to create a big Eurasian partnership which might turn in the future into the broad cooperation framework on Eurasia. We have already launched talks in the format 5+1 on the agreement on economic and trade cooperation between all the participants of this process. It is important to develop the human capital. Only high-skilled professionals with only the world with high-skilled professionals and knowledge available will be the world which could be stable. Decent future is impossible without taking care of the environment and dealing with environmental issues. That is why preserving nature and bringing down the anthropogenic burden on the environment will become ever more important. It is also important to protect health globally. This has to do with global epidemics, with increasing mortality rates in many regions. And there are vast opportunities in this field. We need to give an opportunity to all people, the possibility of a long, rich life. The foundation for the future world must be built today by investing into all much promising areas for the future development of mankind. And it is important that we shape our common future during discussions, wide discussions, to hear all reasonable, much promising proposals. And I'm convinced, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, that in this work, you, the members of the Valdai Discussion Club, will be very actively involved. Your experience, your professionalism will allow to give a comprehensive assessment of processes that are underway in Russia and in the world, to forecast long-term trends, to give assessments of those trends, to give recommendations that would help us to find a way forward towards a more prosperous and more stable future, which we all need so much. Thank you very much.
So we have now heard from all four of our panelists, and we're going to start some discussion here at the front, rather briefly, I think, because there's so many people here who want to ask questions. So maybe I'll lead off with just one very short question to any members of the panel who would like to answer it. I was struck in President Putin's comments by the emphasis on security and insecurity, the security dilemmas that we all face. And then he moved on to development issues later on. And I think, in fact, this was a natural way to do it, because I think one thing we have learned from history is that without security and the predictability that goes with it, there's not going to be development. And so we are at a very painful moment now when we've had a lot of development. Each of the four countries that are represented here, the people who live there live much better than their parents did and their grandparents. This has happened all over the world, but there's something about the current moment that makes so many of us uneasy, and I think the word insecurity captures it very well. The great 17th century English philosopher Hobbes formalized this into the notion of the state of nature, a state of nature in which there is no authority. The lack of authority breeds insecurity and instability, and an inability by individuals to plan and make their lives better. His solution to this dilemma was to advocate the creation of a strong state. And that started to happen in the world around that time, and the state-building process continues. But of course, states then need to be controlled. And they also need to learn to live with one another in a peaceful fashion. So the way I would put this very general question to our panelists would be something along the lines of the following. In the comments, the presentations of each of you, there was reference to the Hobbesian solution, generally speaking, which is to do something about building institutions, building or perhaps changing institutions. And so if I were to ask you naively, so what should be our top priority right now? President Putin emphasized towards the end the importance of the United Nations and making it more effective and somehow using it, I gather, in concert with other forces to develop a Marshall Plan for the Middle East. Some of the other speakers referred to the need to reform established institutions. That was, I think, President Mbeki's argument. From our European colleagues, we heard reference to success stories, institutions including the EU, which is a relatively recent invention. So it was new, it was invented relatively recently. So what is the most important thing here? Should we be thinking collectively about creating new institutions to deal with security and development questions? Or should we be talking about returning to institutions that have been neglected, like the UN? Or should we be concentrating first and foremost on reforming the institutions that already exist? And when I say institutions, I guess I'm thinking primarily about international institutions. So I would invite members of the panel, perhaps starting with President Putin, to share a few thoughts with us on this score, if they wish to do so.
Yes, thank you. Well, I fully join what has been said by Mr. Thabo Mbeki. He said, I've even written it down, that we need a system of international law which would be respected by all countries. We need to go back to the United Nations Charter. This is correct. And if he did not say this, I would have to say this myself. I fully share this view. We're just neglecting the UN Charter. We are pushing it aside from the decision-making process. We are pretending as if it is obsolete, as if it doesn't matter anymore. But when the world faces acute problems, everyone, those who are to blame for the violations of the UN Charter, start to call for the implementation of the main provisions of the UN Charter. But we should remember this from the very beginning and respect the UN Charter from the very beginning. We need a reliable system of international law which would be a guarantee against any abuse of power.
Please.
So I think that it's the basics. The biggest unit what we have organized now, I mean at the local level, is the nation state. But we also know the weaknesses of the nation state. But still I think that we should try to build it stronger in a way of what I'm coming from the north, of course, I speak about the welfare state. So not only the political rights, the democracy, human rights, rule of law, good governance, but also the welfare, the social, economic, cultural rights of the people, all people, also minorities. But then when we think now that what's now the difference between the Millennium Goals and SDGs, I remember the feeling when I was co-chairing the Millennium Summit, the real feeling I had by the people that they want to make a better future. And I think this is very important through the years, because some people said to us that we are just innocent or naive, or the blue eyes, that when we hope that we can make a better world. It has succeeded, like we all have said, not in all points, but much better than without. And now, if we compare these MDGs and SDGs. The MDGs was mainly made for the governments, especially for those who are richer, better doing, to show the solidarity, global solidarity for the South. But now the SDG contains still these elements, but we see also that the world is something else than the nation states. It's also NGOs and business community. And I say very openly that this is a challenge, that how to monitor the system where you have more actors than just the governments. And that's why I welcome all those ideas, and fisheries coming. Heinz is coming from Austria, which has a very good research institute, JASA, which is specialized for systemic analysis. There are also the others. And I think that in this group, Valdai, you could have a good possibility to try to connect such kind of the experts who are specialized for this system analysis. I think this is one part of the answer for your question. And then very simple words, confidence building, because I think that this is even in the base of the nation state, that all the things what we can do for confidence building, whether it's the Baltic Sea, our common sea, or whether it's something the bigger area. And then I would be also very interested to know that when we are now in Russia, that how you see Mr. Putin, Vladimir, how do you see that, what is the role of the Russia in that way future? I understand that the others will answer first, but then I have a glimpse of hope for your interest concerning UN.
Would you like to respond now, Mr. Putin? We'll get to the others.
Well, I think that we'll listen to other panelists first,
Very
and then
good.
I'll answer.
Sure. Mr. Fisher, sorry.
We all know that institutions and wrong constructed institutions may be a part of a problem, but in most cases they are not the whole problem. And the same institution that function very well in a certain situation may, in a different environment or in a different economic situation, seem much weaker or even wrong constructed. As far as the European Union is concerned, the last years or the present situation, if I look at the trade agreement with Canada, for instance, it is obvious that a part of the answer, at least, would be a stronger possibility for the central institutions in the European Union, more power for the Parliament, more power for the Commission, and common economic and fiscal policy. On the other hand, it is obvious that exactly that is a sensitive point, and many people have the feeling our autonomy, our possibilities as a state are more and more transferred to Brussels, to a central institution, and we do not want more. So if somebody says, let's start a process of modernizing and changing institutions of the European Union, at this moment I would say, wait a little bit, not too much hurry, because at the moment it would create a very bitter fight in most or in several European countries. As far as the United Nations are concerned, I listen with great interest the arguments saying the Security Council, who is the most powerful institution, was shaped more than 70 years ago. It would be helpful and it would be necessary to give the Security Council a structure which takes care on the present situation and on the present distribution of inhabitants and power and economic power, etc. But here again we can see how difficult it is and how, if I ask the representatives, Austrian representatives in the United Nations, they say no chance. There is too much antagonism, too different opinions. So the solving problem through changing institution may only be a part of what can and what should be done.
Thank you. Mr. Mbeki?
But must be done. You see, President Halonen, when she spoke, she said the UN had focused on three matters. One, if I heard you correctly, security, human rights, and development. And I really am convinced that globally, and we're talking about security globally, human rights issue globally, development globally, it's not possible to address any of those three big issues successfully, I'm talking about globally, unless we look at the United Nations again. In the context of the UN Charter, in the context of agreed policies, agreed by everybody. I think the conference recognizes this point that we have a multipolar world. And you need the exercise of that multipolarity in order to address all of these challenges successfully globally. Now, what multipolar institution exists? It should be the UN. The matter of the reform of the Security Council becomes important in that respect. Because as Heinz Fischer says, it's established long time ago. Does it reflect that multipolarity of today? It doesn't. So it needs change. It's difficult. Russia is a permanent member. They might be one of the obstacles to changing it. I don't know. But you see, it needs transformation, that Security Council. We need to look at the relationship between Security Council and the General Assembly, with ECOSOC, which means looking at all of the structures of the UN, I'm saying, to express that multipolarity so that we can globally succeed to address these matters of security, human rights, and development. You can't avoid it. I'm not saying it's the only thing that needs to be done, but you need those structures strengthened, You need them more representative, you need them transformed, and you need them activized in a manner that indeed truly respects what would be international law as amended, and addresses the matter that President Putin mentioned of respect for the right. I'm not saying because we've got a UN, therefore the nation state and the right of people, identity, and so on cease to exist. You've got to recognize that and respect that. That equality of nations recognizes the existence of nations, but with I think the reform of the UN structures, so that they effectively can be the home of that multipolarity, of the exercise of that multipolar power, is really translated into something real. Otherwise, we would not have Iraq, we have not had Iraq, we would not have had the disaster in Libya if this thing was functioning properly. As a continent, just to finalize, we're talking about the SDGs. Very important for the African continent, as I was saying, and I'm sure for all developing countries. But one of the problems we face on the continent is very difficult negotiations with the EU about the economic partnership agreements. I'm sure the economic partnership agreements about which the EU is insisting are contrary to what the SDGs seek to achieve. But the Europeans are insisting that this must be done because consistent with the Cotonou Agreement, et cetera, et cetera. But if you look at it at the global level, you would have to say, let's relook at those EPAs to see whether they are consistent with the objectives stated in the SDGs. That brings back into focus the importance of the UN structures, even on these development issues. Thanks, Moderator.
I was a bit nervous that my rather general question would not elicit interesting responses, but I was quite wrong. Thank you very much. Mr. Putin, if you care to respond briefly to any of these things, please go right ahead.
Да. Значит, сначала...
Yes, thank you. First, a very short remark with regard to what has been mentioned by Mr. Fischer. He's mentioned the discussion within the European Union with Canada, the trade treaty with Canada. This is a matter entirely up to the discretion of the EU, but just a short remark, if you don't mind. Yes, I am aware that a certain irritation is being caused by the position of Wallonia. Its population is just 3.5 million people, and yet the 3.5 million people have blocked such a global decision as the trade partnership with Canada. But when Belgium established the EU, it based it on certain principles. And Belgium assumed that it and its part, Wallonia, would have certain rights within the EU. If by this time the EU has grown, its composition has changed, this doesn't mean that the rights within the EU have been changed too. Yes, they can be changed, but first, it has to be submitted to the consideration. These rights have to be changed in a democratic fashion, and only then their consent can be required. Now, moving on to the next issue, I'm not as well aware of this issue as the Europeans do. This is the matter of supranationality in the EU. The number of obligatory decisions taken by the European Parliament with regard to the EU members is far greater than the number of decisions that the Supreme Council of the USSR had taken with regards to the republics of the USSR. Whether that is good or bad, it is not up to us to decide. We advocate a strong Europe, but different points of view exist in Europe itself. I do hope that sooner or later they will come to some positive outcome. The next issue is the United Nations. I've already mentioned that, but I'm going to reiterate it. We must certainly get back to what is written within the UN Charter, because there is no other organization as universal as the United Nations. If we abandon the UN, we will be plunged into chaos. There is no other universal organization in this world. The situation has changed. That is true. The UN and the Security Council need to be reformed reconfigured. As our foreign ministry says, this can be done. But if we want this instrument to be efficient in future, this has to be done on the basis of a broad consensus. We need the overwhelming majority of international actors to agree to that. Why is it so important to get back to coherent, consistent understanding of the UN provisions and norms? The UN was established after the Second World War. There was a certain balance of power that existed back then. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States decided that there was no other part they had to come to a compromise with to coordinate their actions. So in the mid-90s, there were strikes against Belgrade. As a matter of fact, it was an aggression. I'm not going to talk about the humanitarian component, which had preceded the decisions that were taken. But just witnessing a country at the heart of Europe bombed at the end of the 20th century was something barbaric. I thought it was something barbaric because it didn't have the sanction of the Security Council of the United Nations. It was done bypassing this institution. But this trend only grew stronger. What happened in Iraq? Did the UN sanction the operation in Iraq? And before that, we saw what happened in Afghanistan. Yes, we remember the tragic events of 9/11 in 2001. But in accordance with international law, first, there should have been an application to the Security Council, and a resolution should have been passed. A resolution was passed on Libya. The experts who have gathered here know what is written in that resolution. A no-fly zone was supposed to be established, but there were airstrikes against Libya. So the sense of the resolution was perverted, and there was a gross violation of the UN Security Council. Now moving on to Syria, Taria and Heinz have mentioned that, I believe. The number of terrorists is growing in Syria because of what's happening in Aleppo. But was it the starting point of this upsurge in terrorism? Were there any terrorists in Iraq? No. There were no terrorists before statehood was destroyed. Nothing like that had ever existed in Libya. There were no terrorists whatsoever. But once the statehood was demolished, a vacuum of power was filled. But by whom? By terrorists. The same happened and is happening in Syria. I do understand that hint at what we're doing, the Aleppo thing and the people, but wait a minute. Before we launched our operation in Syria, terrorists had emerged in Syria. The war had started long before that. Those terrorists had been trained. They had been taught to attack Assad. They were provided with arms, and they have grown quite efficient. And this is what we're witnessing up to now. These terrorists are the most efficient military units. As some people think, they can be given a direction, and then they're going to be taken care of. But they're not going to be taken care of. This is not going to work. I would also like to respond to what's happening in Finland. Indeed, bells are tolling for those who perished in Aleppo, but let's also ring the bells for those who died in Mosul. I think more than 200 people have been shot by terrorists hoping to halt the onslaught against the town. But in Afghanistan, 120 people were killed with a single airstrike. What is happening in Yemen? These bells should be a token of memory for all these innocent people who have died. We often hear it said, Aleppo, Aleppo, but what is the question? The choice is as follows. Either leave Aleppo as a hotbed of terrorism, or minimize the victims among the civilians and destroy this hotbed. Let's get away from Raqqa. Our partners often say that Raqqa should be destroyed as a hotbed of terrorists, but Raqqa is also home to civilians. Does this mean we're not going to fight those terrorists? If terrorists take people captive, do we leave them be? No. Take the example of Israel. Israel never does that. They always go to the end. They fight to the end. And that's why Israel has survived. And we have to fight. Should we cede ground, we're going to lose. Tarja has asked about the security around the Baltic Sea. Let me remind you that it was not on our initiative that this problem arose. It was during my visit to Finland, and it was brought up at the initiative of Mr. Lenius, the president of Finland, quite out of the blue. It was a surprise for me. He requested that the Russian aviation should not fly without transponders quite active. Transponders are the special equipment that send a signal that an aircraft is in air. If a transponder is turned on, it certainly strengthens security in the Baltic Sea. That's true. From the very beginning, I said the number of sorties of our aviation was manifold less than the flights of the NATO and other flights, but I also promised to His Excellency the President that we would bring up this question during the forthcoming meeting of Russia-NATO Council. Let me report to you, we have brought up this question, but our NATO partners have declined this proposal. Moreover, they have declined the proposal of President Putin, as they have put it. But that is not my proposal that they have declined. That's the proposal of Finland's president. Incidentally, for us, it was quite difficult to make this step for us because there are some technicalities, some things related to military specifics. I'm not going to go into that, but I've given the instructions to our defense ministry to seek this opportunity without any prejudice to our defense. The defense ministry has come up with a proposal, but our colleagues are not willing to accept it. So all questions should be addressed to Brussels, to the headquarters of NATO. Thank you.
Tarja, you wanted to reply briefly, I think.
If I can answer, so it's good that we still have this good dialogue between us, Mr. Putin. So speaking openly and frankly, normally a little bit smaller group, but I think that this proposal by President Niinistö was, I think, a very good example. It's really, I mean, necessary for the security in our area, but also, like Mr. Putin said also, that it has also a lot of technicalities, trainings, and other issues in both sides, which also tells that even it's very short issue, or let's say limited issue, it takes time and experts and so on. But I think that we still fully agree that it should be, because of the safetiness in the air, that should be organized. So I hope good luck further and patience to do the good work. If I can very briefly also now say two other aspects that you, Vladimir, approached me. One is, of course, that when I mention Aleppo and Yemen, these are two examples which has been very much in the media and in publicity, at least in the Western countries. I think might be also in the Russian side. We know also that it's not black and white. It is difficulties. But what I said was that we have to respect this feeling of the people, that they quite correctly say that this is not right. And UNICEF said the same from UN side. But now again, it's good to criticize, it's difficult to give the good responses, but that's why we have the experts to say it further. And coming back to the UN, I'm very happy that we have spoken so much about the United Nations. I'm a UN animal in such a way that I have worked years and years with UN, and I still will work, and I have promised it to Ban Ki-moon and to next Secretary General. But all that what happens in United Nations tells also that doing nothing can be also very expensive. We luckily noticed it with the climate change, but for instance, concerning the Security Council, I also followed Mr. Lavrov with great interest. So I think so that if we cannot succeed, like also President Putin said, in the Security Council issue, so the other things will happen. For instance, the General Assembly or ECOSOC and many others, because the security is a broad system. And in that way, the difficult tasks don't become easier if we push them forward. And so thank you that you promised that you said that you will take it again in all sides. Thank you.
Okay, so what I would now like to do, thank you all, is field some questions from the audience. So we have a rather large set of people here today. Almost everyone wants to ask a question, and so when you're the one who's responsible for recognizing questions, my popularity ratings, Mr. Putin, were higher than yours yesterday in this building. But there is only so much time, and by the end of the evening, I'm sure my popularity will have plummeted towards zero. So I'm going to do my very best. I have been talking with a lot of people about questions they might ask, and I have just a few at the very beginning that I've settled on. And once those have been asked and responded to, we're going to just open it up, and I'll try and recognize hands as I see them. So I'm going to start now. And these questions now, many will be addressed to Mr. Putin if history is any guide, but we'll have people who will want, on the panel, who will want to comment, even if it's not addressed directly to them. So we will really play that by ear. So I'm going to start with Clifford Kupchin, please. Where are you, Cliff? Here he is. Microphone.
Mr. Putin, President Putin, Cliff Kupchin with Eurasia Group. As you know, there is increasing concern in the international community about cyberspace and about cyber conflict. The key issue, of course, is the worry of cyber attacks to achieve political goals, especially at a time where cyber is a very young problem, not like traditional war. And the norms and dynamics of cyberspace are very largely unknown. There's a UN report, the Group of Governmental Experts, which Russia endorsed, and it stated that nations should not use cyber to attack the critical infrastructure of other nations. So my question to you, first, should, in theory, and I heard what you said before, so in theory, should national electoral systems, in your view, be considered critical national infrastructure? And secondly, what specific rules would you propose as the international community thinks through cyber to reduce the risk of future cyber war? Thanks.
На мой взгляд,
As I believe, interference into domestic political process of one country into the domestic political process of the other country is unacceptable. Whatever the way of interference is, whether it is with the help of cyber attacks or with the help of some other tools which are controlled by organizations within countries. For example, you know what happened in Turkey. You know the position of President Erdogan with regard to what he believes, and he believes that the attempt of coup d'etat was made in Turkey by structures that were brought up in the spirit and with direct involvement of the organization of the so-called Gulen, who has been living for 9 years in the United States of America, and this is unacceptable, as well as cyber attacks are unacceptable. But we cannot avoid any mutual interaction in the and influence in the cyberspace. But you've asked me specific issues on electoral systems. I think this is absolutely unacceptable, but the question of how to avoid such incidents, if they occur somewhere, there is no other way but to agree with each other and to develop certain rules. Such rules which would be commonly interpreted and recognized at the governmental national level and could be verifiable. So there is a question of the freedom of internet. But we know that in many countries, including in those countries that have always been in favor of the freedom of internet, attempts are being made to limit access to internet. This has to do with crimes that can be prepared in the cyberspace. For example, that is an attempt to attack bank systems and illegal money transfers, suicides, crimes against children. But these rules are being adopted at the national level, so we can adopt such levels on the supranational level in interstate relations as well.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize Andrei Sushinsov now, and then we'll do Mr. Bystritsky. Yeah, yes, потом. Andrei Sushinsov.
Vladimir Vladimirovич,
Mr. Putin, Andrei Sushinsov, MGIMO University, the Valdai Discussion Club. Foreign mass media have an opinion that Russia has a favorite candidate in the U.S. presidential election, that is Donald Trump. What role does the figure of the future U.S. president play for Russia, for bilateral relations, and what conditions should U.S. foreign policy meet to normalize relations between Russia and the U.S.? Thank you. As regards the so-called favorites in the election campaign in the United States, you've said that there is an image created by mass media. Yes, it was created by mass media, and I would like to assure you that this is not an incident. And I know very few examples of when some ideas are created incidentally in mass media. This idea was promoted by mass media with a single goal. The goal is to fight, is a fight between those who protect interests of the representative of the Democratic Party, Hillary Clinton, in the fight against Mr. Trump, the representative of the Republican Party. How is this being done? First, an image of an enemy is being created, and that enemy is Russia, the Russian Federation, and then it is declared that Trump is Russian favorite. This is nonsense. This is just a way of political struggle, the way to manipulate public opinion on the eve of presidential election in the United States. Well, it's true, and I've said on many occasions, we do not know how any candidate would act. We do not know how Mr. Trump would act. We do not know how Mrs. Clinton would act if she is elected. We do not know what commitments they would fulfill or not. But for us, it doesn't really matter who will win the elections. But we can't but welcome the words, the ideas, the intentions mentioned in public, referring to the normalization of relations between the United States and Russia. And in this sense, we, of course, welcome such statements, whoever makes them. That's it, I guess. As for Mr. Trump, he seems to have chosen his own method, his own way to appeal to the electorate. What way is this? He's been quite extravagant, and we see this, but I think that this has some underlying meaning, because as I believe, he represents the interest of that part of the society, of the American society, which is tired of the elite that has been in power for decades. He represents the interest of common grass voters, and he is playing like a simple guy who criticizes those who have been in power for decades, and as we read the U.S. newspapers, who don't like that the power can be inherited. This is mentioned directly by some U.S. experts. So he's working in this field. Whether this is efficient for him or not, we will see from the election results. But let me repeat once again, we will work with any president elected by the U.S. people and who will want to work with us.
Владимир Владимирович, можно вопрос?
Mr. Putin, can I ask you a question to follow on the issue of security that has been raised recently? It's clear that the key element of security is cooperation. And it's clear that this cooperation can be complicated in the context of transporters that have been mentioned. But, well, aircraft can fly, but there are critically important fields when it is the lives of people that are at stake. The Tsarnaev case was mentioned. The Tsarnaev case has been mentioned recently, and as far as I understand, the information from the Russian side was submitted, but this did not have any effect, as I understand. Does this mean that in these practical terms, our cooperation within the security, the situation is critical? I've already said this. I don't remember when exactly, maybe when I met the French journalists. Yes, indeed, we did provide data on Tsarnaev brothers to our US partners. We have written them once and then once again and received no response. And after the second or the third time, we received a response that the Tsarnaev brothers are US citizens. Okay, that's none of your business. We will handle this on our own. I've told the director of FSB that we will put this into archives, and this information is still in our archives. Unfortunately, several months later, the terrorist attack took place in Boston during a marathon. People died, unfortunately, and it's a pity that this tragedy did take place. Had our contacts and trust been at a different level between us and our partners, I'm sure we would have been able to avoid this tragedy. Later, the US partners, after the terrorist attack, came to us. We provided them with information, but it was too late because people had already died. This partially answers the questions that had been asked before. Those who want to work with us, who formulate the correct idea that it is a necessity for all, especially in terms of anti-terrorism. In this sense, we welcome all those who make such statements, and I have also already said this, while preparing for the Olympic Games here in Sochi, the US partners did provide support to us. I'm grateful to them for this. We are all grateful for this. And they've been cooperating with us here on the ground very efficiently and at a higher level, at the level of the authority of leadership of intelligence services. There were other examples of good cooperation, and in general, we're cooperating well with our European partners in this area. For example, with French security service, we have frank, professional communication. We exchange information. It's not that bad, but it could have been much better.
All right, I would like to ask now Sabine Fischer from Berlin. There she is.
Спасибо. Sabine Fischer, Fond Nauki Politik.
Sabine Fischer, Foundation of Politics from Berlin. My question is addressed to President Putin. It has to do with Ukraine. President Putin, recently, after a long pause, the meeting of N4 took place in Berlin, and after that meeting, the sides have given a slightly different interpretation of the results of those negotiations. That is why I would like to hear what is your assessment of those talks, of the results of those talks, and of the atmosphere of that meeting. And besides, do you believe that the Normandy format is efficient in the way it exists, or do you believe that it could be more productive if, for example, the US joined this format? Thank you very much. May I ask you a clarifying question? What is this different interpretation of the results of the meeting? What are you talking about? I didn't quite hear this different interpretation. I just didn't hear about them. Well, there were discussions of the police mission in Donbass on the one hand, and there was, on the other hand, the focus on the roadmap in Russia that was made by the Russian media and during political debates in Russia. As far as I remember, these were different interpretations of the results of the talks. Well, this is an open secret. Let me tell you the way it was. Maybe I won't mention some specific details, some sensitive details, just so as not to confuse anyone, not to impede the process. As you know, the Minsk agreements, I think that all experts present here have read this. It is written here clearly, 30 days after the Minsk agreements are signed, Ukraine, the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine must adopt a law, a decree that would shape the geographic limits of the regions where the law on the special status would enter into force immediately for these unrecognized republics, because the only thing that was lacking was the description of these geographic limits. These should have been adopted not by the law, but by the decree of the parliament. And this decree was passed, although with a delay, and it seemed that this law should have entered into force immediately. But let me remind you that this law was adopted by the Parliament of Ukraine. It was voted for, and it was coordinated with unrecognized republics, and that's important. And in this meeting, I think it is a viable and key element of the political settlement. But after adopting the decree by Rada, the Ukrainian side, the Parliament of Ukraine, adopted an additional provision to this law, to this decree, Article 9 or 10, in which it was written that this law would only enter into force as soon as municipal elections take place on these territories. So once again, the entrance into force of the law was delayed. Let me repeat that this is a key law for the political settlement of the crisis in southeast of Ukraine. No coordination has taken place with unrecognized republics. No consultations have taken place with unrecognized republics with regard to this law. We discussed it actively in Paris last year. I insisted that this should be done immediately since it's set forth by Minsk agreements, and this is a key element, as we believe. Nevertheless, President Poroshenko insisted that it was impossible, and we came to a deadlock. Since it came to a deadlock, and it could have finished back then in Paris a year ago, all of a sudden, Mr. Steinmeier, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany, offered a compromise. Let us do the following. This law would enter into force on the day of the election of the municipal authorities on a temporary basis, and it would enter into force on a permanent basis after the OSCE or DIR would recognize that these elections had been held in accordance with the OSCE rules. This is not what was written in the Minsk agreements, but in order to break this deadlock, I agreed to this formula. I said that we would coordinate this with Donetsk and Luhansk. We did coordinate it with Donetsk and Luhansk, but at the Berlin meeting, President of Ukraine made an attempt to change the Steinmeier formula, this compromise formula. He went even further. He, in fact, refused from any implementation of this law, and a crisis emerged, the same as it was the case in Paris 1 year ago. But I would like to commend the role of Federal Chancellor. She did find the necessary argumentation. She convinced all those gathered there that we needed to stick to the agreed stance and that it was impossible to change each time what had been agreed upon before, because otherwise we will never reach any agreement at all. But the details and specifics of how these should be implemented, we agreed to write down these details in the concept that we are about to develop, as you've said. A lot has been done on security. We have agreed almost on every provision in terms of security. Nothing has been agreed with regard to humanitarian issues. These territories are blocked. The situation is very complicated, and the so-called civilized world turns a blind eye to this. Let us not even bring this issue up for discussion, but as for the format, whether it's useful or not. There is no other format. There is no alternative. The discussions are not easy, maybe not very efficient. I would agree with this, but there is no other format. And if we want to achieve at least something, we need to stick to this format. Regarding your question whether we need to involve someone else, the Russian position is that we are not against involving any other actors, including our American partners, but we have agreed with all the stakeholders that we will work with our American colleagues in parallel. And as you know, my advisor and Ms. Nuland meet on a regular basis and discuss these issues. They are looking for a compromise, and of course, this is not being done behind closed doors. All participants of the normative format are pretty well aware of this, and we do reckon with the position of our American partners.
Angela Stent, please.
This question is for President Putin. I'm Angela Stent. I'm a professor at Georgetown University in Washington. Mr. President, Russia recently withdrew from an agreement with the United States to dispose of weapons-grade plutonium, but at the same time, the Russian government said that it would consider rejoining the agreement if 3 conditions were met. Firstly, that NATO troops should withdraw to the level that they were before 2000 in Europe. Secondly, the Magnitsky Act should be repealed. And thirdly, that the sanctions imposed on Russia after the beginning of the Ukraine crisis should be lifted, and Russia should be paid compensation for them. So my question is, we will have a new president on January the 20th. I'm optimistic about that. Are we to understand in the United States that these 3 conditions would form the basis of an initial negotiating position on the Russian part with the American president when she re-establishes high-level relations with the Kremlin? Thank you.
You are a professor, not a diplomat. You can see that. If you ask a diplomat, they will tell you there is a thing which is called sort of a request position. A decision on the disposal of excessive amounts of weapons-grade plutonium is not an agreement we have withdrawn from. The US has withdrawn from the ABM treaty. We, on our part, have suspended the agreement on plutonium. Why is that? I believe that everyone who is here is aware of that. This agreement provided for construction, both in Russia and in the US, of plants that would dispose of excessive plutonium produced both in the US and in Russia. The US has not just failed to fulfill their obligations, it has announced that they are not going to fulfill their obligations, citing some financial difficulties, as if we had not had financial difficulties of our own. We have constructed a factory and we dispose of our plutonium on an industrial scale. The US has announced that unilaterally, without talking with us, they say that they're going to dilute weapons-grade plutonium and store it, but that is what is called a recovery potential by our experts. This plutonium can be taken back, it can be enriched, whereas we dispose of it entirely, destroy it on an industrial scale. We've built a factory, we've spent a lot of money. Does this mean we are richer than the US? And this is the case with regard to many issues. It's very difficult for us to talk with the current US administration because almost all promises, all agreements fail to be fulfilled. With regard to Syria as well, probably we'll get back to that later. Anyway, we are willing to talk to the US new president, and we are willing to search for solutions to any difficult issue that might arise.
Mr. Raja Mohan from New Delhi is, where are you?
Mr. President, my question is on Russian policy towards Asia. the emphasis today in the Russian foreign policy is on the construction of a multipolar world. But do you also give some thought to the importance of a multipolar Asia? Both in your speech today and the general construction of the Russian foreign policy is to point, I think, to the growing, deepening contradictions between the US and the West on the one hand and the Eurasian situation. But it's also a fact that there are internal contradictions within Eurasia. The rise of new powers is creating a lot of fears. The breakdown of the old order in some parts is releasing primordial forces. These are internal to Eurasia. But is there a danger that Russia, by its emphasis on a multipolar world, is underestimating the dangers of a unipolar Asia, and that the need for great powers to work together to construct a genuinely democratic multipolar Asia?
We are intensifying the development of our relations with Asian countries, not because we have tensions with the US or Europe. What's happening is an imperative of life. There is a need to intensify our contacts. The very life itself requires that. The simple fact is that the significance of Asian countries is growing, and this importance is going to grow, and at a great pace too. But for Russia, its territory is largely situated in Asia. It would be senseless to not use this geographical advantage and not to develop relations with our neighbor. China is our neighbor. I said that in my introductory remarks. With India, we've got a great legacy of relations, so it would be absurd not to use this legacy to further advance our relations with India. We've got many interests that coincide. We quite naturally complement one another, both in politics and economics. As for multipolarity or unipolarity in Asia, there is no unipolarity in Asia, and we see that, we understand that full well. Life is very complex, very diverse. It's full of contradictions. The important thing is that these contradictions should be settled in a civilized manner. I believe the Asian leaders today have enough common sense to build this model of dealing with one another, and we are willing to follow this model as well. As you're aware, our defense minister, and just recently, I've been to India. I paid a visit there, and our defense minister has just got back from India. So not just our defense ministries, our industries, defense industries are working together. We've got great cooperation, many coinciding interests with India, with China, with Vietnam, with other countries of the region, and civilian industries. They are very promising, very large scale.
Saw Thomas Gomar's hand. Where are you, Thomas? There he is.
Mr. President, Thomas Gomar from IFRI. In September 2014 at the Valdai Club, you described the relation between Ukraine and Russia by the following sentence: Dwie strony, один народ. Today, how would you describe the relation between both countries? Thank you very much.
Вы знаете,
You know, I'm not going to place the guilt, the blame right now, just as I thought back then. I still think that Ukrainians and Russians are one people. We have people of radical views, of nationalist views, both in Russia and in Ukraine. But on the whole, this is one single people with one history, with one culture. Ethnically, very close. First, they separated us, and then they set us at each other's throat. But we are the ones to blame for that. And it is up to us to find a solution to this crisis. I'm confident that common sense is going to prevail and we're going to find this solution.
Fang Xiaolei, please, from Shanghai.
Mr. President, before I ask my question, I'd like to say a few words to you. I'd like to pass to you the greetings of my students. 2 years ago, when you were in Shanghai, you had to tend to your own agenda, and yet you didn't have a chance to meet our students. They didn't have a chance to ask questions of you. And yet, they are always telling me that they are glad to see you whenever you come. Whether you retire or you don't, it's indifferent to them. They'll be always happy to see you. Today, we are talking about a philosophical issue. Human communities have seen many different systems of international relations, the Vienna system, the Yalta system, after the Second World War. What is your view of the future of the new emerging system of international relations? What will it look like? What are the elements we should pay our attention to? It's a bit on the theoretical side. What do you think should be the principles that should lay the foundation for this system? Should they be more universal or more individual? What should be the combination of these principles? What do you prefer? Certainly, right now we're witnessing a very lively discussion about the relation between Russia, the West, and China. Thank you. Heinz here has just made a remark. This is a very philosophical issue. We can talk about that quite at length. Whether the world of today is going to look like it used in the past. No, certainly not. That is quite impossible. The world is changing quite drastically. The China of the 1960s or 70s, does it look anything like the China of today? These are two different countries. The USSR is no more as well. Mr. Mbeki has been talking about Africa, and I agree with what he said. Africa cannot stay at the periphery. If there is anyone who thinks like that, then they are greatly in error. Should we follow this logic, then we are going to face serious issues. Right now, there is much talk about refugees, about Syria. Just today, I saw news reports from the Mediterranean there, the Italian Coast Guard were catching refugees from Syria. They were helping them out of the water. What's the relation of Syria to that? That's a very important question. The relation, the future of the world and Africa, the system in Asia, there are many potential conflicts there. The question is whether we're going to have enough courage and enough common sense to find appropriate solutions to all the crises that we face, the complex conflicts that we are up against. And I would very much hope that is going to be the case. I want the world to be truly multipolar, for the opinion of each and every member of the international community to be taken into account, whether that is a small country or a large country. There should be universal rules that safeguard the sovereignty of all nations. As for the relations of Russia with our partners in Asia and Europe and the US, we are building up a multi-vector policy, not just due to our geographical position. Our policy with regard to all of our partners is based on equality and mutual respect.
Хорошо. Николай Злобин, пожалуйста.
Nikolai Zlovin, please. Mr. President, I've also got a philosophical question. I believe you've given that quite some thought. So I'd like to receive your own answer. I know that you know how to formulate your thoughts quite eloquently. You have talked a lot today, but there is one thing I do not agree with you entirely on. You've given a very good description of the world, but reducing everything to some malicious will of an elite is slightly wrong. There are many objective factors in play in the world. Right now, when talking about the Eurasian cooperation, you said that that is the requirement of life itself. I remember when Crimea happened, you said, I couldn't have acted any differently, even though the rest of the world thought that what you did was not a gesture of goodwill at all. A question related to that. I believe countries pursue their national interests in compliance with their world perception very often. National interests of different countries are at odds. Once you said that your job is to advance the national interests of Russia, so I suspect that you know what Russia's national interests are, not just tactical interests, not the interests of today, the fundamental interests that used to exist and that are going to be in play in future. Certainly it's early for you to talk of retirement, but national interests are going to stay. Do you have a formula to explain to the world what we're talking about? The world sees Russia as an unpredictable country. Is there a formula you can cite which will describe Russia's national interests? What will be legacy in future? What's good for the Russian person is the national interests of Russia and the nations of the Russian Federation. The question is not about advancing these national interests at any cost. The question is how we should advance these interests. Let me get back to the core issue of today. We believe that pursuing one's national interests should imply a dialogue with all the international actors, respecting their interests and in compliance with the universal rules of games, which are called the international law. Taria said a couple of words which to me, or she said that my picture was somewhat gloomy. If that is your perception as well, if you think that the errors of the elite are to blame for the problems of today, then I'd like to say that you have misconstrued it. This is only one problem we're facing today, the divergence of views between the elite and rank-and-file citizens, but that is not the only problem. There are many other factors. The most important thing is how we advance our interests, how we move them forward. Thank you.
Alexei Mukin, пожалуйста.
Alexei Mukin, please. Thank you, Alexei Mukin, the Center for Political Information. Mr. President, in Ukraine there are always attempts at prohibiting something Russian. It seems as if all Russian components are simply pushed away from Ukrainian society. So a philosophical question to follow that up. Petro Poroshenko has mentioned that he wants to sell his Russian business. What about this Russian business? Does it still exist, and what is your attitude towards that? We seek to respect the property right. Alexei Leonidovich is a great advocate of that. He believes that this right is one of the pillars of economic policy, and in that sense I agree with him entirely, even though we do not agree on everything. And certainly practice has to be amended, amendments have to be made to the legislation, but respecting the property right is what we're going to aspire to, and we want to respect the interests of our investors, foreign investors, including Ukrainian investors. Mr. Poroshenko is one of these foreign investors. He is a owner of a large factory in Lipetsk region, or even 2 factories. There are certain issues related to the non-refoulement of value-added tax, and yet the factory is working at a good pace. Salaries are paid, profits are made. There are no restrictions whatsoever with regard to how this profit is used or how it's transferred abroad. I do not remember the figures. I do not delve into these details, but this factory is profitable, quite successful to boot. Pedro Dukevich, please. Mr. President, I asked that question of Deputy Foreign Minister, but I realized my mistake. Only you can answer this question of mine, Mr. President. The question is as follows. I've got information. I do not know whether that information is correct. During the meeting with President Obama in China in September this year, you talked about the ceasefire in Syria.
And it seems, I'm not sure whether this information is reliable, that you were offered a 7-day ceasefire. You had some doubts and said that this was impossible to ensure such ceasefire through such short period to disassociate radicals from the moderate opposition. That was not feasible, and the answer was that if we don't manage to do this, then you are free to do anything. Could you please recall this conversation, because it is very important for the history of what's going on now in Syria. Thank you. I do not need to recall this conversation. I have never forgotten this conversation. It's a very important conversation. We did talk about putting an end to the airstrikes by Russian and Syrian aviation against terrorist facilities in Aleppo before separating the so-called reasonable opposition from Jabhat al-Nusra, which is a terrorist organization recognized as such by the United Nations. And these terrorist organizations included into the list of terrorist organizations. I would like to note that it is an open secret that our U.S. partners promised to do this. They recognized the need to do this. They recognized that a part of Aleppo was occupied by terrorist organizations, by Daesh and by Jabhat al-Nusra. And you can see this from the footage on television when we see the flag of ISIL or Jabhat al-Nusra in some areas of Aleppo. Our U.S. partners recognized that there was a need to do so, and they assured us that they would do this. And after that, we agreed that we would start to jointly determine the reasonable part of opposition on the ground and determine where terrorists are. And together with our U.S. partners, we would work jointly against these terrorists. That was promised to us on many occasions, both on the level of defense ministry and on the level of foreign ministers, on the level of security services. Unfortunately, over and over again, all these attempts failed. Nothing has been done. And this issue was once again brought up during our meeting with President Obama in China. Yes, indeed, my U.S. counterpart, President Obama, came up with a proposal to once again disengage these parts of the opposition. First, he insisted that we should declare a day of silence to stop airstrikes by aviation, and then during the 7-day period, they assumed the obligation to disengage the reasonable opposition and Jabhat al-Nusra from each other. I'm not going to dwell into details because I do not think that I have the right to mention such details in public, because there are some things during such discussions that must stay off the record. But the fact remains the fact that instead of disengaging, disassociating terrorists from Jabhat reasonable opposition from terrorists and Jabhat al-Nusra, our U.S. partners disrupted the ceasefire. And by the way, at the end of the day, I insisted that first we need to disengage and then to stop airstrikes. At the end of the day, I agreed with the opinion of the U.S. partners. I told him, yes, okay, first we will declare the ceasefire, we will have no airstrikes, we will not fly, and we'll have the 7-day period. The ceasefire was announced, if I'm not wrong, on the 12th of September. On the 17th of September, the U.S. aviation launched an airstrike against Syrian forces, and after that, ISIL launched an offensive. We were told that this was a mistake and that ISIL launched it as offensive by incident. Maybe this was an incident, but the ceasefire was disrupted and it was not our fault. As for what the President of the United States promised or not, you should ask him this question, and I think that during his visit to European countries, he will talk about this with European partners. I think this should be a frank and honest statement instead of trying to influence the Russian position on Syria. And by the way, you know, it's the 9th day today when the Russian aviation and the Syrian aviation do not launch any airstrikes in Aleppo and in the neighborhood of Aleppo. But we do not see any disassociation between reasonable opposition and terrorists. If we do not fulfill obligations assumed by us, we will never succeed in anti-terrorism efforts. I do understand that this is a complicated mission and we are not to put any blame on anyone, but if we agree on something, we need to implement this, and there should be no shifting of blame. We should not be blamed of all deadly sins. This is simply not a decent behavior. We are being quite restrained, and we do not answer to our U.S. partners in the same manner, but we could do this at some point.
Please, from Slovakia.
Čarnogórsky, Bratislava.
Čarnogórsky from Bratislava. I would kind of follow on the question asked by Angela Stand, although there was no agreement between us. Mr. President, the conditions that you have outlined with regard to the treaty on the elimination of weapons of plutonium are, in fact, the compromise conditions. Had these conditions been implemented, this would mean that all concessions of Russia made since the time of Mikhail Gorbachev would have been annulled, offset. What is your assessment when these conditions could be met? Or let me put it in a different way. Do you think that these conditions will be met as a president of the Russian Federation? Well, the conditions you've talked about, the conditions which you've called offensive conditions, are laid down on paper. This is the decree by the President of the Russian Federation. Do you understand this? This is a paper. But the conditions for the elimination of weapons-grade plutonium violated by the United States is a grave issue in the area of international security and handling of nuclear materials. These are two totally different categories, and we have withdrawn from this treaty because the U.S. does not fulfill the obligations it has assumed. And as for the conditions for a discussion of broad range of issues, we will agree on this.
Mikhail Pogrebinsky, пожалуйста.
Mikhail Pogrebinsky from Kiev. Thank you. Mr. Putin, going back to the question that had been asked by the colleague from Germany, as far as I understand, you haven't given a full answer to this question. What we're talking about is that interpretations of the Berlin meeting were different in Kiev and in Moscow. Let me say a couple of words that the Kiev interpretation is as follows. The main success of Poroshenko, the main thing is that the Poroshenko succeeded at these talks and that he convinced you that you agreed to the police mission. At the same time, Kiev understands this police mission as some system that would be armed and that would be ensuring security before and after the elections. The information from Moscow was slightly different. Could you please clarify this matter? I can ask Tarja or Heinz, who are well familiar with OSCE, with how this organization works. I could tell you what my stance on this issue is. President Poroshenko made an initiative, put forward an initiative of the so-called police mission during future possible elections in Donbass, in Donetsk and Luhansk. And I was the only one to support him. I'm just not calling this a police mission since all other stakeholders object. And the reason why they object is not because they do not want to help Mr. Poroshenko, but because OSCE has never done anything like this before. It does not have the relevant experience, it does not have the staff, it does not have the experience of police missions. And as of today, this idea was put forward by President Poroshenko. It was supported by me, but it has not been supported by other stakeholders. We do not call this a police mission. We call this the possibility for those who are going to ensure security during the elections with the personal arms. Those who are against this proposal indicate that this could be a provocation in terms of using arms against armed people. They believe that the power of OSCE observers, not that they have personal arms, but that they represent the universally recognized international organization, and they are unarmed, and that using force and arms against them would be unacceptable and would be seen as unacceptable behavior on behalf of anyone, and that is their force. Their force lies in this, not in a gun. But if Poroshenko thinks that this would benefit the process, I would support him, but I'm the only one who supports him in this. This is a weird situation. This is the only situation where our opinions overlap, and there is nothing new about this. I've already talked about this many times before. At the end of the day, everyone agreed that this is possible, but this should be worked through, including in the OSCE. Maybe Tarja would correct me, but as far as I know, OSCE has never had such precedents in its practice. Tarja, can I ask you this question?
I have to say honestly that I cannot remember now, so it's better that we ask somebody who has more up-to-date information. But coming back.
Okay, Fu Ying, please, from Beijing.
Thank you. Just now, former president of Austria, Mr. Fischer, said the relationship between EU and Russia is not as expected 25 years ago. And it's unfortunate, and it's hard to be optimistic. So I want to ask Mr. President, from your point of view, why so? And was the expectations or the assumptions 25 years ago was wrong, or something went wrong on the way? And from a philosophical point of view, what do you think is the lesson to be learned for the next 25 years? Thank you.
what was done right, what was done wrong. The expectations were huge in connection with the fact that the USSR became an open society, a transparent society. What was considered crucial, what divided USSR, Russia, and the Western world disappeared. I'm talking about ideological differences. And frankly speaking, first in the USSR under Gorbachev and then in Russia, everyone believed that we would have a totally different life. As one of our experts mentioned rightly, there are some things that go much deeper than ideological differences. These are the so-called national and geopolitical interests. And we could have done something differently. Yes, we could have done something differently. And during the last Valdai Discussions Club, I told about the German politician, Mr. Raum, who unfortunately passed away. But back then, he was in a very active discussion with the leadership of the Soviet Union, and we have a record of those discussions, although we can't make them public. He said that a new system of international security should be established in Europe, that there was a need to establish some other structures beside NATO that would include the Soviet Union and those countries that withdraw from the Warsaw Pact, but with the participation of the US to make this system a balanced system. And he continued that if this is not done, this would result in the system created in the Cold War working against the Soviet Union. As he said, this is a concern because this would be an imbalance of the international relations system and the issues of security would be put to test. As this man told, this was the case. And back then, people who were working on global transformations did not want to change anything. They thought that they were handling the situation. Others did not have a political will to implement these correct ideas of a very wise and well-experienced German politician. But it is my hope that, nevertheless, as soon as the real balance of powers changes, the diplomatical, political accompaniment of these changes would change for the better. The world will become more balanced and multipolar.
What I also can add to that is 25 years ago, that were the early 90s. And in the early 90s, the European Union had 12 members. Sweden, Finland, and Austria joined only 94, 95. It was the time of a sort of honeymoon between Russia and Europe, in particular Russia and Germany and Russia and other important European countries. It was the time before the economic crisis. The growth rates were bigger. It was even the time before the introduction of the euro. The euro is very important, but the euro is also accompanied with some problems if you look to Greece or to Italy, etc. So these factors also have to be taken into consideration. Thank you.
I will also add that 25 years ago, the Russia was different and European Union was different. Russia joined to the Council of Europe with after quite a long process, and I was myself also involved in that. So I think that one lesson what we could perhaps learn also in EU side and in the Council of Europe side is that it was a very good time to make an enlargement. But perhaps we should invest more in the enlargement process, not only before the enlargement, but also afterwards. And perhaps then the process could be easier today. But, you know, sometimes the things have to be hurry up and you have not quite enough time. But we cannot take back the past. We have to try to build now how it is further.
Gabor Stier from Budapest.
Gábor Stier, Vengria, Gazeta Magyar Nemzet.
Stier, Hungary. My question is for President Putin. It concerns Ukraine. As soon as winter approaches, over recent years, it has been often the case that we talk about what's going to happen in Ukraine, what's going to happen in terms of security of Russian gas, export security of Russian gas. Is there going to be warmth in Ukrainian apartments? Will Kiev pay for gas? Where will it buy gas from? My question is as follows. Are there any discussions underway on supply of gas at the moment, both to Ukraine, and did you discuss this with President Poroshenko in Berlin? Well, we are worried about what's going on now in terms of this very important energy component in Ukraine, because as we believe, as our specialists believe, and they are not worse than those in Ukraine, because it used to be a single system during the USSR. We are perfectly aware of what's going on there, and to ensure continued supplies to Europe, we need to pump in the necessary amount into underground storage facilities, not for internal consumption, but for transit. That is the technological feature of what has been done during the Soviet Union.
Недостаточно.
The gas that has been pumped into the storage facilities is not sufficient. From 17 to 21 billion cubic meters should be pumped. I think right now it's just 14. Moreover, some of this gas is being taken away from the storage facilities. And this is a source of some concern to us. President Poroshenko and I, at his initiative, have had a conversation about the gas supply to Ukraine. He asked me if Russia would be willing to restore the supply. Yes, certainly, we can't do that at any second, and nothing else is required. We've got a contract, we've got a supplement, but the only thing required is prepayment. And depending on the size of this prepayment, we are going to provide guarantees that will supply the necessary amount of gas to the customers in Ukraine. Right now, the price of gas for Ukraine, we had agreed on that. Previously, that was said last year, is going to be no more, and I'd like to emphasize that, than for the neighboring countries like Poland. I cannot provide you with the up-to-date figures, the price levels, but when that conversation took place, Poland, in compliance with the contracts, was buying that at $185 for 1,000, and for Ukraine the price could be $180 for 1,000 cubic meters. So I cited these figures. They offered that we should follow the reverse model, even though that is in violation of the contract between Gazprom and its counterpart in Western Europe, and we decided still to turn a blind eye to that, because if they prefer to use the reverse model, then it's up to them to decide. But as far as I understand, the price for the industrial customers in Ukraine is more than 300. We offer them $180 for 1,000 cubic meters. You see, there are middlemen who use in these deals. They provide a chance for this reverse deal. Probably they are too dear to the authorities of Ukraine. All right, it's up to them. The only thing they should do is safeguard the transit to European countries through Ukraine. Fyodor Luka, please.
Fyodor Lukyanov, Valdai Club.
Fyodor Lukyanov, the Valdai Club. As a follow-up to what you've mentioned, Mr. President, it has been evoked afterwards. We all read the leading papers. We see wonderful covers of journals and magazines. Yes, I do see the covers of magazines. Is it pleasant for you to feel the most dangerous, the most influential man on earth? Is that a source of pleasure? You know, I'm very glad to talk to you today. I like that. But I believe a far more important thing is the consideration of the Russian budget at the Russian parliament, because this budget should help us sort out the most important questions our country is faced with. I refer in particular achieving a certain pace of economic growth, addressing social issues, which we have plenty of. Luckily, we have managed to rein in our inflation, I do hope, and according to the experts, inflation rate is going to stand no more than 6%. I do hope that the budget deficit is not going to be more than 3%, the goal that we've set for ourselves. As you know, we have also drastically reduced the capital outflow from the country. There are different reasons explaining that, but this outflow has indeed been reduced. And yet there are many outstanding issues the country is facing. I refer in particular to the issues in the economic field, in the social field, and on these issues depends our political stability as well as Russia's weight in the international arena. That's what I'm thinking about, not some imaginary political authority. You know, we've been working for 2 hours and a half. And as moderator, I've got to ask you a question. How much time do you have left? It's your decision. Well, I've come here to talk to the audience. You are the head of the process here, the moderator. So I am going to submit myself to your decision, to the procedure that you think is proper for this event. Well, in that case, another half hour. The President is ready.
Somewhat of a list here, and I'm going to try and renew it. I'll recognize another speaker, Yuri Slyoskin from Berkeley, California. And please keep your hands up for a minute so I can try and repopulate. Oh, my goodness. Well, we may be here all night. So, Yuri, where's Yuri? There he is.
Well, let's not spend the whole night here. I'm from the Berkeley, California University. I teach Russian history. What do you think is going to be the most important topic, theme, in the chapter, the Putin era, and future textbooks of Russian history? These chapters are already being written. Some call you the state builder, a reformer, a centralizer. They compare you to Catherine the Great, to Peter the Great, to others. Others believe that you are more the conservator, the custodian of what we have. Others distinguish two periods within your reign, first the state building and the reactionary period. And in this sense, they compare you to Stalin and Ivan the Great, the Terrible. What is your view of this chapter and a future textbook? And another question, which can be a follow-up. Who and what do you think is going to be the central part, the centerpiece of the next chapter after the Putin era? Mr. Volodin just recently has reiterated his thesis that if there is no Putin, then there is no Russia. I believe that emphasizes the importance of an element which is of a great importance for any system, the succession mechanism. In Russian history, this succession mechanism rarely worked as it was supposed to. What do you think should be done for the next chapter in the textbook on Russian history, that it's not called the time of troubles? Well, I certainly do not look like Catherine the Great due to my gender. As for the most important thing, which I think is going to be of interest to those who learn Russian history in future, the most important thing is how we've managed to bring Russian society, Russian people together, unite them around addressing and achieving the national goals. Let me get back to the Soviet-era historiography. I'd like to emphasize that however important a personality is in history, the people, the citizens of the country are the ones who build the history. Now, as for your question about who and what is going to be the subject of the next chapter, it's up to the people to decide. It's up to the people to make a choice. And they are the ones who are going to elect the next leadership of the country.
Добрый день. Samuel Cherub, Washingtonское отделение.
Good afternoon, Samuel Chair, Washington, chapter of the Strategic Research Institute. I've got a very concrete... Are you a spy? No, I'm not. Who are you then? I'm a scientist, an academic. Well, I do not think there is any bad about that. Well, I'm sorry, I'm going to tell you a story afterwards about a prominent political leader in the US whom I much love and admire. We had a very interesting conversation. I'm sorry for interrupting you. I've got a question about the INF Treaty. Right now, the INF Treaty is facing certain difficulties. There are many recriminations, quite vociferous too. And in this context, it is very important to understand Russia's attitude, common approach to this treaty. Does Russia see any worth in the INF Treaty? If it does, what is this worth? And if there is any worth, is there any worth keeping it, so to speak? You see, the INF would be of great worth to us if other countries would follow the example of Russia and the US. What did happen? The naive leadership of Russia was willing to destroy ground-based medium-range missiles. Pershings have been demolished by the Americans. We think, yes, SS-20s, they were also dismantled. And there was a tragedy, as you know. The main constructor of these systems killed himself. He thought it was a betrayal of national interests. He thought it was unilateral disarmament. Yes, we dismantled our ground-based systems. But this treaty didn't cover the medium-range missiles based on sea or in air, air-based and sea-based medium-range missiles were not covered by the INF Treaty. The USSR didn't have such medium-range missiles, whereas the US decided not to cover them with the treaty. So there was a disproportionate imbalance. But there is no difference. The USSR simply renounced this type of weapon. And the US has kept their air-based and sea-based missiles. No one around the US, neither Canada nor Mexico, produces that kind of weapons, whereas our neighboring countries, in the Middle East and Europe, there are countries that produce this type of systems. So for us, it's quite a trial. And yet, We believe that we are bound by this treaty. We believe we have to observe it. Moreover, right now we have sea-based and air-based medium-range missiles.
Call on Mr. Taisuke Abiro from Tokyo, please.
The Tokyo Foundation of Japan. It has been announced that you're going to pay a visit to Japan. The visit is going to take place on December the 15th. It was announced on September the 20th. Right now, active negotiations are underway to prepare for this visit. I'm quite confident that your visit is going to be a great impetus to strengthening the relations between Russia and Japan. In this context, I have a following question. On the eve of this meeting with your counterpart, with the Prime Minister Abe and Vladivostok, you gave an interview to the media. In that interview, you said that the current atmosphere of relations between Russia and Japan was not sufficient to achieve a peace accord. My question is your assessment still the same as of now? And if that's the case, then how realistic is it to expect the emergence of such an ambience which would allow Japan and Russia to sign a peace accord? Are we talking about the next 2, 3, or 4 years? Thank you. You see? That's one of the cases in which, as I believe, it is impossible and it's going to be even counterproductive to set any deadlines. When we talked with China about territorial issues, these talks lasted for 40 years. And we signed this final definitive documents because we had managed to achieve an unprecedented level of cooperation. We call it even something more than a strategic partnership. It is a privileged strategic partnership. We've achieved a very high level of trust and mutual confidence. Regrettably, our relations with Japan have not yet been elevated to the same level. But this does not mean that that is impossible to achieve. Moreover, in my view, both Russia and Japan are interested in achieving a final settlement to the outstanding issues, because it is in compliance with our national interests. That is what we want, that is what we seek. When it's going to be done, how it's going to be done, if that is going to be done, that I cannot answer. That's a question we've got to find an answer to together, based on the groundwork that has been made, and certainly keeping an eye on the future. I do hope that our foreign ministries, our experts, are going to make a contribution to that process that is going to lay the foundation for further advancement. Orietta Mascatelli, please.
Orietta Mascatelli is Italian Sky News.
Orietta Mascatelli, Italia. Deputy Foreign Minister Bogdanov told us that should Libya or Iraq ask for assistance, would you take that seriously? You would take that seriously into account. Please tell us if a new military intervention by Russia is possible in the Middle East. Do you think it can be of help to sort out the issues there? What do you mean when you say intervention? A legitimate or illegitimate? Well, to help fight terrorism, to conduct an airstrike. What is your view? I don't know what your view is. Maybe intervention is not the correct word. An action, an operation. Yes. We're not planning anything like that anywhere.
So,
Is that all? Well, 2 or 3 sectors more. Yes, that one. Otherwise, yes, the farthest. I know, we meet you all the time. Please give the mic to someone else. Thank you, Mr. President. Konstantin Zatulin, State Duma. Mr. President, we've had a discussion here on Syria, and I asked a question to Clifford Catchin. He didn't answer that question. I said that we had come to Syria, to the Middle East, to help sort out a very sensitive issue to the West, the fight against terrorism. But right now we are witnessing double standards with regard to operations in Aleppo and Mosul. So my question was, would we have achieved a victory against Hitler if our actions had always been accompanied by recriminations, if we accused us of acting wrongly in Europe and we accused them of acting wrongly in the Atlantic? And another question. In Syria, they tell us that we always have to take into account the opposition. The opposition is well respected. They are invited to Lausanne, to Geneva. When we're talking about Ukraine, we have talks in the Normandy format. But the Donetsk or Luhansk People's Republic never participate in these talks, and yet they're parties to the conflict. Why are they not recognized as the parties to the conflict? The same as it happened in Transnistria or in Ossetia. Do we need to seek that?
This is not a question. This is unfortunately the sad fact that in accordance to which principles are being violated. Principles of conflict settlement. When conflicting parties should be directly involved into decision-making. And secondly, the violation of the Minsk agreements themselves. Because the Minsk agreements have been signed by the representatives of Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. And the Ukrainian side insisted that it be signed by the representatives of the republics. We did receive these signatories. Now the Ukraine refuses to talk to them. This is counterproductive. That is all the comments that I could make. Are there any foreign colleagues who would like to ask a question? Let's give the floor to our foreign friends in the right sector, in the far right sector. And then I'll ask our Russian colleagues not to offend, since our guests have come from far away. Yes, please, you have the floor. So first, second, third, and fourth sector, and then we'll end.
And I have great honor to be invited here 6 years in a row. And I have a very simple question. We're all from different countries in the world. You also know that quite a few of us have a different opinion of what you're doing. And we may have a different opinion about the foreign policies of Russia under your leadership. But still, every year you come here to have this profound and substantial exchanges with us, spend extreme amount of time with us. We know that you have hectic schedules. You're one of the busiest person on earth. So my question is that, why you come here? Why you talk to us? I know you're the only leader on earth that have this kind of exchange with intellectuals from all over the world. What do you have to gain from this? How this, from your point of view, can promote Russia's national interests and beyond? Thank you very much.
There are two goals. To listen to smart people, to experts. I am really interested in hearing your opinion. It is useful for me and for my colleagues. And the second reason is that to bring to you our point of view. I think this is important. Yes, please, this sector. Yeah, yes, please, maybe you.
Thank you, Mr. President. I don't really care why you're here, but I'm very grateful that you are. I think we all are very honored by having you here. My question is about relations with the United States. The criticism of the United States in your speech was much less harsh than it was several years ago, but I don't think anybody who knows the words used would be surprised that most of the criticism was aimed at the United States. So when I listened to what you said about our elections and about some of our behavior, I couldn't help thinking what the headline would be in the United States when the transcript of this came out. And since you like to have feedback, let me give you some as an analyst, and I hope you won't kill the messenger, as we say. I think people in America will probably say, does the Russian president really believe the description of the American political process that he presented? Does it really, is it being put forward in order to deflect criticism in America of the Russian political process? Or is it a throwback to something that maybe you thought was our system but really wasn't? That's my first question. Because honestly, your description of our elections sounds exactly like our description of your elections, which that's one point. My second is this description of the violation of international law, for example, in Belgrade, sounds exactly like our description of what happened in Crimea. So I would like to ask you a question. Is our dialogue on both sides helped by such descriptions here on Russian television and in the United States on our television? And we have an expression that if you're in a hole, the only way to get out of it is to stop digging. And so my question to you is, are there steps, unilateral steps, steps with other countries that could be taken that would break this cycle of descriptions of each other which are really not helpful? And do you think, because I think without this, the prospects for our relations probably are not very bright.
Well, yes, of course, I agree with you in terms of the need to at least make an attempt to break this circle. But we were not those who actually charted this circle. We were open in the mid-1990s. We expected to have an equal dialogue. We hoped that our interests would be taken into account. We expected to have discussions, to make a compromise, but all questions cannot be settled unilaterally. You have cited an example of bombings in Belgrade, and you also cited an example of Crimea. Well, thank you for giving these examples. This is a wonderful example. Bombing in Belgrade is indeed an intervention in circumvention of the norms and rules of international law. Did the UN Security Council authorize this military intervention in Yugoslavia? The United States did it unilaterally. You would answer to me, citing the example of Crimea. But what about Crimea? What did you do in Yugoslavia? You separated a part of the state. You separated Kosovo from Serbia. In Kosovo, the parliament voted after military action, after the intervention, after numerous victims. The decision was adopted. Everyone agreed to this. In Crimea, there has been no war. There have been no bombings. There has been no military action. There have been no victims. No one died. The only thing we did, we ensured the right of people to express their will in full accordance, by the way, with the UN Charter. And we've done almost the same as you did with regard to Kosovo, but slightly more. In Kosovo, it was the parliament that adopted the decision on separation, but in case of Crimea, people came to the referendum and they expressed their will during this referendum. And later, the parliament adopted this decision and addressed Russia as an independent state in order to reunify with Russia. We could continue these debates forever, but we need to break this circle, this vicious circle. I've mentioned this many times, and let me reiterate. Yugoslavia, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, NATO expansion. some things are being forgotten, some provocations are being made. Then we're told that this is evil Russia making some steps that, well, there should be no provocations from your side. There should be no provocations from your side so that we actually protected our interests. Let's agree on something. It is impossible to agree with you. What we agree upon is not being implemented. I would really love to have another relations with a new administration, the relation of partnership and mutual reckoning for each other's interests. Any question? Yes, please. In the back row. Let's give the mic to this lady. Thank you. Oksana Antonenko. Mr. Putin, if you allow me, I would make a small remark and then I'd ask a question. Answering to the question asked by Fyodor Lukyanov, you said that it is much more important for you what's going on in Russia, the budget, the reforms, that it is much more important than foreign policy. Together with the World Bank, we conduct polls every 5 years in all countries with transition economy, in ex-CIS countries and in Eastern Europe, in Turkey. And in the Middle East, the last poll has been just conducted, and it included the question of how people perceive their status, and we received very interesting data on Russia. People with 30% of the lowest income in Russia have not changed their attitude to life over the last 5 years. Despite the inflation, despite the decreased real salaries, despite of what has happened over the last 3 years. But the people with the 30% of the highest income, the drop amounted to almost 30%. This is the biggest figure among all transition countries. This is an interesting information. You have not mentioned yet whether you're going to run for presidency in 2018. If you are going to run for presidency in 2018, how do you want to prove to these people that you meet their interests? Don't you think that they want to diffuse geopolitical tensions, to conduct reforms and to fight corruption? We all want to diffuse geopolitical tensions, but not through the funeral. If to diffuse geopolitical tensions we need to bury ourselves, we would not be satisfied with this. No one would be satisfied with this, including those who doubt the efficiency of current authorities or those who would want drastic changes. There are quite many people like this in Russia. Since you've said that most people are satisfied with the status, I think this can be explained by the minimum level of unemployment. It is less than 6%. In some European countries, the level of unemployment is more than 25% in some EU countries. In Russia, it is less than 6%. We have our own problems, especially in North Caucasus, concerning the employment. That is my first point. My second point would be that we do want to fulfill the social obligations that we assume. And people see this, that on the one hand, we do have problems. On the other hand, the state is doing everything possible to fulfill its obligations. We have a well-balanced social policy and macroeconomic stability. And through these measures, we make sure that the active layer of the population, the business community, can have good prospects to improve the situation. You mentioned the geopolitical tensions. Are we interested in geopolitical tensions? But you can't get what something wants from us exclusively at the expense of our national interests. There is no dialogue. That's the main problem here. Some position is being formulated, then it is declared as the only right one, and the whole discussion is reduced to how quickly we would adopt that position. That's it. Is that work possible? And we face the situation in almost all spheres. When some things are promised, nothing is being implemented. You represent an important institution, an important financial institution. We have a good history of our relations. Why did you curb projects in Russia? That is a question I would like to ask you. This project was set up not to aggravate geopolitical tensions. It was developed to ease geopolitical tensions, but even such institutions are used for other goals. This is sad, but this was not invented by us. With regard to limitations, and this is a cause of our concerns, no one likes them, no one likes these limitations, but I think that even if there had been no problems with regard to Ukraine, southeast of Ukraine, Crimea, Syria, some other pretext would have been found to curtail Russia, to hold Russia back, because the West does not like Russian independent position on some issues, because the West wants to put squeeze on Russia. If U.S. partners have not done something on Syria, they send Europeans to us, trying to put squeeze on the other side, but this is not a way of dealing with problems. Some experts in the West believe that Russia incurs losses, grave losses. I think that's an exaggeration. 0.5% of GDP, that is the estimated loss, but I do not think this is the case. The European countries themselves lost export to Russia in the amount of almost 60 billion US dollars or euro, I don't remember exactly. That is the benefit that they have not received from the genuine, normal cooperation. Our losses are due to drop in oil prices, gas prices are linked to oil prices, and chemicals, prices for chemicals and petrochemicals are related to oil and gas prices. There is a chain of these interactions. Financial restrictions are also poisonous because they irritate investors, and this is what the 30% that you've mentioned do not like. I don't like it either, but we will try to. But we need to have a two-way street. Yes, please. Thank you. Arkady Ostrovsky, The Economist magazine. Mr. President, over the last 15 years, Russia has made considerable progress in terms of in the economic field. The economy has grown considerably. Russia has turned with an income more than average. There is a powerful middle class in Russia now. The first post-Soviet generation has grown up. Those people who are now 25 years were born in 1991. We saw some of them during protests in Moscow in 2011, 2012. Do you believe that for the further development of the Russian economy, there is a need to change the economic and political model in the country? That's my first question. And my second question is, there are huge concerns caused in the West by everything that has to do with nuclear weapons, and when Russian mass media mention that America could be turned into nuclear ashes, which have not been even said in the Soviet times. Do you think that this rhetoric with regard to nuclear weapons is acceptable? Thank you very much. Well, my first point, changes. Changes are always needed. Without changes, we'll be stagnating. The question is how to carry out these changes, whether it is going to be a revolution, and as a rule, this would only hurt the country. I believe that those people that you've mentioned, some are already gone, others are far away, as we say in Russia. Even if we suggest that they wanted changes for the better, they have chosen the wrong method, the destructive method. What we need is an evolution. And I really hope that we will keep moving forward through an evolution. I'm not going to dwell into details because we're limited on time, but we're thinking about this. We have a center of strategic research. As we attract and invite experts, we think about how we're going to develop prior to the presidential elections and after 2018 as well. As for the nuclear weapons, rattling with nuclear weapons is bad. This is bad rhetoric. I do not welcome it. But we need to proceed from the reality, from the fact that nuclear weapons are a deterrent factor and they are a factor that secures peace and stability on the global scale. Nuclear weapons should not be seen as a factor of potential aggression, because it's impossible. Because this would mean the end of the world, the end of our civilization. But as a deterrent factor, nuclear weapons are important, and many experts believe that the world had known no major armed conflicts for 70 years, thanks to a large extent to the possession of nuclear weapons by major powers. But it is important to observe the non-proliferation regime of nuclear weapons, of means of delivery, and it's important that all nuclear powers treated the nuclear status very responsibly. Russia will adhere to these approaches in future, despite any statements that are sometimes made. But let me reiterate, at the state level, Russia will always treat its nuclear status responsibly. By the way, you have given me a pretext to say that when our American partners unilaterally withdrawn from the ABM treaty, let me remind you, and that's very important, we said that since we were not ready to develop such systems back then, because we didn't know how these systems would work, whether they're efficient or not, this would force us to improve our attack systems. The response from the US side was, okay, do whatever you want. Since ABM system that we are going to develop is not aimed against you, we will proceed from the assumption that what you are doing in terms of Russian attack systems is not against us. I said, okay, let's agree on that, and we are working. But in such a way, whether we want this or not, the arms race was somehow pushed. My main point is that everyone should treat this responsibly, and Russia will do this responsibly.
We've just crossed the 3-hour mark, and I think we will agree that we, of our 4 panelists, Mr. Mbeki came the furthest, but Mr. Putin certainly worked the hardest. And so I would like to thank all of them, and thank you for your many questions, and I'm sure there are dozens more if we had only more time. But this was a very, very excellent panel. Thank you.
Спасибо.
Thank you. I would also like to thank everyone. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all my colleagues for patience, for participation. Thank you.